And welcome to Meet the Experts, Mail and More, a series designed to address the challenges facing leaders in the print and mail industry. Each month, we'll have an expert share their insights and knowledge on the ways you can be successful. Attendees are muted during this webinar, so please use the Q&A box for any question. Also, a recording of the webinar will be made available to all registrars. So connections play a critical role in individual, community, and societal health. We're wired for connections, yet we're often becoming more isolated. In our new hybrid world, people are impacted when their connections are compromised. Building and maintaining our business and personal networks will improve our chances of success in business and in life. In this episode, we'll be talking with Neal Fedderman, Senior Manager Logistics Operations at CarMax, and also the National Industry Co-Chair for the Postal Customer Council Advisory Committee. Neal will talk about understanding what a connection is and the impact of real connections. Neal, welcome to the episode.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
So Neal, I know you both as a friend and a business associate. So can you share with our audience today your story, both in the industry and how you came to be here today?
So I guess in the spirit of Halloween, should I say it was a dark and stormy night, or should I just get into it?
Let's just get into it.
So I started over 26 years ago as just a temporary associate in mail. I started with Circuit City, and I thought it was a good opportunity to get involved in corporate America the easiest way possible. So just understanding the experiences and things of that nature, it was something I thought I could excel in, and it was fun. So I worked through Circuit City, and eventually, because CarMax was a sister company to Circuit City, I moved over into CarMax and became an official CarMax associate. So technically, I'm CarMax's first mail operations associate. So from that point in 2001 to now, I've actually had the opportunity of growing with the organization and growing parcel and mail operations. So I've had the opportunity of becoming a senior clerk on to senior coordinator manager, senior manager of parcel and mail operations, and now fortunately I am a senior manager of logistics operations for CarMax.
Outstanding. Now, I also mentioned that you're the industry co-chair of the PCCAC, and that's how we became in contact with each other. Can you talk just a little bit about your involvement with PCCs and then what you're doing at the national level?
Yeah, so that actually, my involvement in the PCC started in Central Virginia in 2001. I actually had a vendor that it was pretty funny that said, well, Neal, you ask a lot of questions, but I think I know an organization that could help you answer some of the questions. And the funny thing about it is that was my first involvement with the PCC in Central Virginia, and I've been involved ever since. So in 2016, I actually became a little more involved on the national level, and I started through like the education subcommittees and worked through membership. And I was fortunate enough to be actually nominated and selected for the executive board. So working through just progression, I'm now the national chair, industry chair for the PCCAC, and it's definitely an honor. It's a lot of it's a lot of learning, a lot of networking, but a great opportunity.
Great. Well, thank you for your service there. Now, this topic came about because of a term you introduced to me called the loneliness epidemic, and I was wondering if you could expand on that a bit.
Yeah. So the interesting thing is when we look into or we experienced the pandemic, it actually exposed a lot of I would say after effects, and one of those was loneliness, so isolation. So it became so severe, understanding that this has been around for years, but it's never really been clearly defined. But last year, the Surgeon General felt that it was necessary to create a report around the social isolation and the lack of connection. So this really hit home, understanding that a lot of entities, organizations, individuals during the pandemic were isolated from those that they were connected to on a regular basis. For example, just reaching over a queue or asking a question. A lot of that went by the wayside, and only essential people had those type of connections. So you had entities and organizations that were not familiar with remote or virtual components. So there was a lot going on until a lot of people kept caught on. But the Surgeon General deemed loneliness an epidemic at the level of where isolation and the lack of connection is just as dangerous as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. He had mentioned that even with those type of scenarios, it does, and you mentioned earlier, it does have an impact on your mental health, your physical health, to the point where it mentioned you had an increase of 29% risk of a heart attack. But you look at it from a financial standpoint, some individuals is, having to deal with those mental, I guess, situations, the health experiences. They're having to spend more in Medicare and healthcare. So these are things they didn't plan for, nor did we plan to have this type of after effect from the pandemic. So when we look at a lot of things from that standpoint, it really had an impact, even to society. When we think about going to visit your family members and having to be isolated and not being able to do that, that really took a toll on a lot of individuals, even to our youth.
And it was interesting because in preparation for a class you and I gave on this, I read a book called Touch Matters by Michael Bannacy, and he started his study, unfortunately, but then I think in some ways good for us in the long term, at the outset of the pandemic. And when we talk about the impact that loneliness has, you mentioned the health side of it and the psychological side of it. Not being able to reach out and touch somebody does have an impact on us. It's been proven, especially in neonatal care, right, with preemie babies, actually with all babies, that they need to be touched right after they're born throughout their lives. And it doesn't change just because we're older, right? We still need that. So what is, when you talk about that now as the pandemic and how it can impact it, what does it mean to the people who are listening today who are leaders? What do they need to be concerned about?
So connections are actually, we have the opportunity to demonstrate connections to show that there are actual tangible results from those type of connections. You can look at it from a standpoint of just your improved work quality, just having that collaboration that takes place. Teams that have strong connections normally have better problem solving skills. You look at it from a standpoint, your employees' well-being. Understanding now that a lot of organizations are implementing that wellness check and things of that nature, they understand that those tangible items actually have that impact. And that could be something in the form of a wellness health day or a personal day that's now added to your calendar that you're allowed to take. It just increases productivity. So that's one of the most tangible. If you have an engaged associate that feels good and feels that they belong, and that's a counteract to a loneliness or isolation component, you're actually going to drive that productivity. But I think the biggest thing is as long as you remain connected with your team, everyone feels like they probably have access to more resources than just being, working as an independent or standalone.
And that becomes even more important in the hybrid world, that even though people, we have customers that are remote first, they're not planning on ever bringing people back full-time to the office. And you have to take that extra step to make sure those people who are working in a room by themselves, like I am, still feel connected to the organization. A rule that we have in our company is every meeting, cameras on. And it doesn't mean I have to wear a tie to every meeting. And I know most of you think I was born with a tie, and I was, but you do have to have your camera on every meeting because although we can't touch, we can at least see each other. And that adds to that power of connection. And I just find that so important that we keep those connections going, even when they're digital. Now, when we first started this discussion year and a half ago, I think you and I started talking about this, and we were talking about networking, but something more. And can you talk about the difference between making connections and networking?
Yeah, so I think the best way to sum it up, and I think I want to, bring this into our conversation. There was a quote that we had around that stated that networking is more about farming than it is hunting. It's about cultivating relationships. So that really it really resonated with me only because when you look at it from the farming approach, that's like establishing those genuine connections. You're providing value to others, but you're looking at it from a long-term relationship approach. The hunting is more of making those quick connections, the immediate opportunities, instant gratification. So those are the relationships that are more transactional. So I always say, don't get caught conducting premature solicitations. So that is a key opportunity for us to correct ourselves when we find that we're in that capacity. And in some cases, we have to be mindful because we want to make those quick connections because we really may have good intentions, but we're looking for results as well. But that comes down to reaching out to someone, and on the initial introduction, you're asking for something. That is the worst way to, while you may make the connection, you won't be able to maintain it. So, Mark, I could use the example of you and I. We conducted it from the farming approach. We discussed woodworking, some of our common interests. So when we connect, it's not always about a transaction. It's just about maintaining that connection, that retention piece. So I think that's what's really important to me, because when you look at it from the farming, there's a lot of success measurements. But when you look at it from the hunting, you also have to realize not only is it an immediate opportunity and people see it as transactional, some people also look at it as they're being approached as prey. So you're less likely to make that connection.
And I just it was very interesting because today on LinkedIn, somebody sent me a connection request with the sales pitch included. I mean, they didn't even have the decency, and I'm sincere when I use the word decency to say, I'd like to be part of your network, and then at least wait a little bit before throwing the sales pitch. In their connection request was the sales pitch. So it was immediately, well, I didn't necessarily feel like prey. I definitely did feel like I was being hunted, that they didn't care about me. They only cared about my business. And that part of, and I'm in sales, so I get that we have to sell, but let's become friends, or at least become connected as humans before we get there.
Right? Absolutely. And I think using that same quote with the farming, in most cases with a farmer, one of the things that is a success measurement for them is sustainability. So that you're building your relationships is about your sustainability. Working with your teams and individuals, especially with the remote, the hybrid, and the virtual situations, you can only be sustainable as long as you still continue to maintain those relationships.
Yep. So in the relationships, there are going to be times when one person or the other in the connection is having a hard time. Could be physical, could be mental, could be family. And you brought in this really important part to the conversation about the difference between empathy and sympathy. And I love that. So could you talk about that for a bit?
So those are key words that we had to learn and actually understand how to apply them appropriately. So with the loneliness epidemic, the isolation or the distancing that we have from individuals that we would normally work work with on a day-to-day basis, maybe in person or in close quarters. We have to make sure that we're understanding a lot of the messages that we're no longer receiving, maybe mouth to ear. It may be a text message, it may be an email, things of that nature. So we have to understand how we are interpreting those. And with that, empathy and sympathy have always come into play. And understanding if you have associates that may not be as engaged or they're having that rough day, we want to look at it from the empathetic standpoint. We want to be able to understand and relate to that person. This way, we have a better opportunity of bringing them on board. If we're looking at them from the sympathetic standpoint, then that could be risky because that individual could see it as you feeling sorry for them, thinking less. And again, if our approach is to engage this person, or especially wanting to understand how they feel, it's important that we hone in on that empathetic before we even move towards sympathetic or anything else. But here's the kicker, and here's the bonus, Mark, because this is something to add to the conversation. There's another term, apathy. We also need to make sure that we're not seeming so indifferent that the individual that we're trying to reach out to does not feel as if I just don't care. I'm really just trying to check this box. So I think in a lot can be lost in translation based on the platforms that we have to use now to communicate on a day-to-day basis.
But you can use some of the platforms to reach across the miles to display empathy. And I'm going to use an occasion that made me very proud to be your friend recently. We had a mutual friend that had to have surgery, and they live alone, and they were going to have a recovery period. And you had a similar experience as far as, being in a similar circumstance. And you immediately reached out to a group of us who all knew him and said, one of the things he needs at this moment, not just cards, not just letters, but he's going to need food. And we can work together, potentially use something like a DoorDash or another way to fulfill his needs, right? And it was beyond just, I feel bad for you. It is, what are your needs and how do we meet it, right? I mean, that was a key thing. And that's something I'm never going to forget. And when I had my surgery years ago, I felt very isolated because I couldn't walk, which means I couldn't get out and around. And I received a gift from somebody who was making it clear, that they were recognizing me as an individual, with something beyond just a platitude, right? So can I go back to the farming just for a bit? Because there was an image that you have used in several of our presentations together, and I love it. And you know where I'm going with this. It's the tomato, right? And you've used the same quote in multiple ways, which is, I'm going to read it because it was Audrey Hepburn. You brought it to me, so I'm not pirating here. To plant a garden is to believe in tomorrow, Audrey Hepburn. And it's that image of the tomato. Why a tomato, Neal?
So when we look at our connections and we're establishing our connections, you look at it from farming. You're planting a seed. You're looking to reap the benefits of the seed. So not to go deep into farming, or I'm not changing professions anytime soon, but the average tomato has 150 to 300 seeds. So from one seed, you could yield that many additional seeds from one tomato. So when you look at it from a networking standpoint, when you're farming and you're building those connections, you're looking for your benefit or your yield to be somewhere in that category or that area. But I think it's also, and I just want to be clear while I'm talking through it, it's also important that not all seeds planted for connection will yield high amounts. So you should actually weigh that connection based on the reality of what it is, not what it's not. But the thing is, going back to that quote, making sure that we're being farmers, not hunters. I think it really helps us to forecast for our future and we're better able to leverage our connections based on how far we expand it.
Excellent. And for our listeners who don't know this, Neal is actually a certified master gardener. So yet again, that our connections go far deeper than just mail. Well, I shouldn't say just mail, but it goes beyond mail. So what are your final thoughts around connections and what people need to do?
So I think the biggest thing is understanding that you are responsible for maintaining your own connections. Not every connection has to be planned. I think the retaining most of your connections or organic conversations, maybe just quick calls, writing a letter, things of that nature that actually just touch base with individuals. I have some of my connections where I may just reach out even with a text message and just say hi, thinking about you, hoping all is well, not necessarily looking for a response. So again, I'm not looking for those relationships to be transactional that I need to hear back, but sometimes it's important for that person to know that they're thought about in order to maintain a connection. So you just can't let it happen. You actually have to own your own networking and connections.
And I love that you brought up writing letters because that's a passion of mine.
I planned it.
Recently my wife and I went to a museum, and the artist, the display of the artist, he had the same editor. He was a children's book author, right? So he did both the text and the drawings, and he had the same editor for his entire career, and they kept their letters to each other. Now, what was very interesting, the reason why I'm bringing it up here, is they signed their letters with love or love. This is a supposedly business relationship, but they knew it was something more. And I think I've talked about this before. I think we're sometimes afraid to use that word. And maybe it probably isn't always appropriate. I'm not saying sign all of your business letters, love, Mark Fallon, president of the Berkshire Company. But I do think, sending letters, as you pointed out, it doesn't have to be a long transcript of something. It can be just thinking of you, Mark, or just thinking of you, Neal. And that's it. And that will still strengthen that connection.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, like you said, the with love, that's an organic statement that you've grown to. So that goes a long way with me as well, Mark.
Yep. So let me just, I don't see any questions in the Q&A. I just want to give the audience a brief second or two to see if anybody would like to put a question in there. I'll click it again to make sure. So Neal, if people want to get in contact with you, what's the best way to do that?
So let's connect on LinkedIn. So this is the interesting thing. So everyone knows me normally as Neal. So the interesting thing is, and you're going to learn something about me, so I'm being vulnerable today. If you're looking for me on LinkedIn, my name is Cornelius Fedderman. Please, let's connect. I would love to have a conversation, but again, not just transactional, but let's be organic in our connections.
And if you do connect with Neal or myself on LinkedIn and you're part of the mailing community, also make sure that you join PCC Voice on LinkedIn, where you can also share where people are sharing. I go there every morning. I go to PCC Voice just so I can see what somebody's posted. They're going to make me smile about what they're doing for our community. And it's just a thank you to both of us, Neal. They appreciate hearing our presentation. Well, thank you all for attending. This has just been so enjoyable. Oh, sorry, somebody came in and I knew it would be this gentleman. Let's put a PCC spin on this. What's the biggest challenge for PCCs to accomplish when engaging members remotely?
So I think engaging PCC members remotely, I think the biggest challenge is ensuring that you have the attention of the attendee on that remote or virtual platform. I think PCCs across the country have experienced that. And I think one of the things that we can encourage is how do you create the engagement? How do you create the interaction so that everyone's involved? The unfortunate scenario around this is because of many of us wearing multiple hats in the workplace, the virtual component allows us to still stay connected, but not 100% engaged. So what I would encourage with most PCCs, and I say this around the country, is find ways to engage them, whether it's, and in some cases, it's the incentive. Could you gamify things of that nature just to have them interacting, or maybe open it up for opportunities to ask questions directly? I think some of the other opportunities is to not focus on the larger groups. Sometimes you may want to work in the small, more intimate groups. That way you can facilitate the conversations and everyone can actually feel like their voices are heard.
And the one other thing I would add, because it happened to me over 30 years ago, was the telephone still works. And, I attended a PCC event back in 1992, and somebody called me up after the event, asked me what I thought, and asked me if I would like to become more involved. And someone just put up in the Q&A, have more online meetings instead of in person keeps me connected to trends and news, right? Which goes back to, we have to do it more than one way. Holly, that's a really, really good point, especially with a lot of travel budgets being cut, right? That's something we're all seeing. Well, Neal, thank you very much for participating in this today. Oh, this is just great. I just want to read this because it goes back to what we said. I know we're almost out of time, but just a comment. Agree you can share your feelings organically and not be afraid to show your passion and love for groups such as PCC. And then they reminded me, not just mail, Mark, right? So, all right. Well, thank you all for attending. Neal, thank you one more time. I look forward to talking buddy next month, but we have a different guest on Meet the Experts, Mail, and more. Thank you.